There's a line in a drover's journal from April 1878 that has never been satisfactorily explained. The journal belonged to a man named Clayton Webb, a trail boss who'd been moving cattle from South Texas to Kansas for nearly a decade. He was not given to poetry or exaggeration. His entries were usually terse: mileage covered, water sources located, head count at day's end. But on the night of April 19th, somewhere along the western edge of the Indian Territory, he wrote this: "The cattle did not sleep. Not one. I have never seen this. They stood in place, all facing the same direction, and they did not move except to breathe. The men would not speak of it come morning." The entry ends there. The next page has been torn out. What follows afterward resumes 3 days later, as though nothing had occurred, though the handwriting appears slightly altered, looser, less steady. A week after the drive reached Dodge City, 2 of Webb's drovers quit without collecting their full wages. A third was found 6 months later working on a ranch near Abilene, and when asked about that spring's drive, he said only that he would not go back through that country, not for any amount of money, and that he did not care to say why. This is not a story about what they saw. This is a story about what happened when an entire herd of 1,500 cattle refused to lie down, and the silence that followed. The spring of 1878 was a difficult season for the cattle industry, though not in any way that would appear in the larger histories. The winter had been mild across Texas, which meant the grass came early, and cattlemen were eager to move their herds north to the railheads before the summer heat set in. The Chisholm Trail and its variants were crowded that year, traced deep into plains by thousands of hooves, and men competed for the best river crossings and grazing land along the way. Clayton Webb's outfit was neither the largest nor the smallest. 1,500 head of mixed longhorns, 11 drovers, a cook, a wrangler, and Webb himself. They had left the area around San Antonio in late March, following a path that would take them northwest through Austin, then north into the rolling prairie country, and eventually across the Red River into Indian Territory. It was a route Webb had taken before, without incident. He knew the water sources. He knew where the herds could be pushed hard and where they needed rest. The men were experienced. Most had been on drives before, some for many years. These were not boys playing at cowboy work. They understood cattle, understood weather, understood the strange and often deadly unpredictability of moving animals across open country. They knew that rivers could flood without warning, that lightning could stampede a herd in seconds, that a single snake in the wrong place could kill a horse and leave a man stranded. They did not spook easily. The country they were moving through in mid-April was what drovers called lonesome ground. It was a stretch of low hills and sparse timber in the western portion of the territory, not yet settled in any meaningful way, too far from the forts to feel safe and too far from the rivers to be convenient. Other drovers avoided it when they could, not because of any specific danger, but because it was difficult country, poor grass, unreliable water, and a sense of isolation that wore on the men. Webb chose the route because it allowed him to avoid the more crowded paths to the east, and because he believed his crew could handle the solitude. They had been on the trail for 3 weeks when they entered that region. The weather had been fair. The cattle were in good condition, moving steadily, grazing well in the evenings. There had been no trouble with rival outfits, no illness among the animals, no injuries to the men. By all measurable standards, the drive was proceeding exactly as it should. Webb's journal entry from early April are routine. Mileage, weather, brief notes on terrain. On April 15th, he mentions crossing a shallow creek and making camp in a basin where the grass was decent. On the 16th, he notes that they covered 12 miles and that one of the steers had gone lame, but recovered by evening. On the 17th, he writes that they are making good time and expects to reach the Red River crossing within a week. On the 18th, the entry is shorter. Cattle restless at night. No cause found. It is the first indication that something had changed. Restless cattle were not unusual. A herd could be unsettled by wolves in the distance, by the scent of a predator, by shifts in the wind, or the approach of a storm. Experienced drovers learned to read these signs. to distinguish between ordinary nervousness and the kind of tension that preceded a stampede. Webb's men checked the perimeter that night and found nothing. No tracks, no scent, no movement in the surrounding hills. But the cattle did not settle. One of the drovers, a man named Virgil Tate, later told a cousin in Missouri that the herd had begun to act strangely just after sundown. Normally, cattle would graze for a time after the day's drive, then gradually lie down in groups, resting but alert. That night, they grazed as usual, but when the time came for them to bed down, they remained standing, all of them, not milling about or stamping, but simply standing in place, their heads raised slightly, their ears forward. Tate said he rode through the herd twice, looking for signs of injury or illness, thinking perhaps one animal was in distress and the others were responding to it. He found nothing wrong. The cattle were calm, in a sense. They would not agitated or try to run, but they would not lie down. He mentioned it to another drover, a man named Wilmackie, who had noticed the same thing on the opposite side of the herd. They brought it to Webb's attention near midnight. Webb came out from the camp and walked among the cattle himself. In his journal, he does not describe what he thought, only that the animals appeared healthy and that there was no observable threat. He told the night guards to stay alert and to wake him if anything changed. The herd remained standing until dawn. When the sun rose, the cattle finally lay down, almost all at once, as though released from something. The men later said it was one of the strangest things they had ever seen. The way the animals simply folded their legs beneath them in unison and rested, and how complete the silence was afterward. Webb gave the order to let them rest longer than usual. The drive did not resume until mid-morning. No one spoke much during breakfast. Tate later said that there was a feeling among the men that it was better not to discuss it, though he could not say why. They covered less ground that day. The cattle moved sluggishly, as though tired, and Webb allowed for frequent stops. The country around them was emptier now, the hills lower and covered in rough grass and scattered cedar. There were no other outfits visible on the horizon, no smoke from distant camps. They saw no game, no deer, no antelope, not even jackrabbits, which were usually abundant in that region. By late afternoon, they reached a place where a dry wash cut through the prairie. There was no water in it, but the banks were low enough to make a decent crossing, and Webb decided they would make camp on the far side. The cattle were driven across without difficulty, and the men began to set up for the evening. The cook, a man whose name does not appear in the records but who is mentioned in passing in several letters, started a fire and began preparing the meal. One of the younger drovers, a boy of perhaps 17 or 18, was tasked with gathering deadwood from the wash. He returned a short time later and told the cook he didn't want to go back down there. The cook asked why. The boy said it smelled wrong. When pressed, he could not explain further. He said it wasn't the smell of something dead, and it wasn't the smell of water or vegetation. He said it was a smell like old air, like a cellar that hadn't been opened in years, and that it was stronger the deeper he went into the wash. The cook dismissed it and sent another man for the wood. That man returned without comment, but later, in a letter to his brother, he mentioned that he had not liked the wash either, though he could not say exactly why. He wrote that the shadows there seemed darker than they should have been, even though the sun had not yet fully set. As night fell, the cattle began to show the same behavior as before. They grazed briefly, then stood motionless, all facing northwest. The men did not need to be told to pay attention this time. Webb assigned 4 guards instead of the usual 2, and he himself remained awake, sitting near the fire with his rifle across his lap. The night was calm. There was no wind. The stars were clear and bright, and the temperature was mild. There was no reason for unease, and yet every man in the camp felt it. Virgil Tate, in his account, said that it was the silence that was worst. On a normal night, there were sounds, cattle shifting, horses nickering, the crackle of the fire, the occasional call of a night board. But that night there was nothing. The fire burned without sound. The cattle stood without sound. Even the men's footsteps seemed muffled, as though the ground itself were absorbing the noise. Around midnight, one of the guards came back to fire and said that he thought he had seen something moving in the wash. Webb asked what kind of movement. The guard said he wasn't sure. He said it had been low to the ground and that it had not moved the way an animal moves. He said it had been slow, almost deliberate, and that when he tried to follow it with his eyes, it had vanished. Webb went out to the edge of the camp with him and looked toward the wash. He stayed there for several minutes, watching. In his journal, he writes only, saw nothing. Guard returned position. But another drover, Will Mackey, later said that Webb had come back to the fire looking pale, and that he had loaded his rifle and kept it in his hands for the rest of the night. The cattle did not sleep. For the second night, they remained standing, their eyes open, their bodies still. The men began to notice other things. The horses, which were picketed near the camp, were also refusing to lie down. They stood with their heads low, their ears pinned back, and they would not eat the grain that was offered to them. One of the drovers suggested moving the herd, pushing through the night to get clear of the area. Webb considered it, but ultimately decided against it. Moving cattle in the dark was dangerous, and a stampede in that country, with its dry washes and uneven ground, could cost him half the herd. He gave orders to maintain the watch and to wait for dawn. The men obeyed, but the tension in the camp was unmistakable. Tate said that no one spoke above a whisper, and that even the whispers felt too loud. He said that at one point, near 2 a.m, all sound stopped entirely. Not gradually, but all at once, as though someone had drawn a curtain over the world. He said it lasted for perhaps 30 seconds, and that during that time he could not even hear his own breathing. When the sound returned, it returned slowly, beginning with faint rustling that seemed to come from the direction of the wash, then spreading outward until the normal sounds of the night resumed. No one slept. At dawn, the cattle lay down again, just as they had the morning before. The men broke camp in silence. Webb gave the order to move out immediately, and the herd was driven north at a faster pace than usual. The drovers did not need to be told to hurry. They could feel it themselves, the need to be away from that place. But as they drove the cattle forward, something else began to happen. The herd began to slow, not all at once, and not in any way that suggested exhaustion. It was as though the cattle were resisting, pulling back against the direction they were being driven. Webb and his men pushed harder, using their ropes and voices to keep the animals moving, but the resistance continued. Some of the steers began to turn, try to face back the way they had come, and it took significant effort to force them forward. By midday, the herd had covered less than 5 miles. Webb called a halt and rode to the front of the column. He later wrote that he could see no obstacle ahead. No cliffs, no water, nothing that would cause the cattle to balk. The ground was open and gently sloping. There was no reason for them to refuse. And yet they did. One of the drovers, a man named Samuel Howell, suggested in a letter written months later that the cattle had known something the men did not. He wrote that animals could sense things that people could not, and that perhaps the herd had been trying to warn them. He did not say what he thought they were being warned about. It was decided that they would make camp early and try again the next day. The location was a flat stretch of prairie with good visibility in all directions. There was no water, but they had enough in the barrels to last another day, and Webb believed that the openness of the ground would be safer than pressing on into uncertain territory. The cattle were allowed to graze, though they did so half-heartedly. The men set up camp in near silence. The cook prepared a meal, but few ate. The younger drover, the one who had complained about the wash, sat apart from the others and did not speak. As the sun began to set, the herd once again assumed the same position, standing motionless, all facing northwest. Webb ordered a full watch. Every man who was not on guard stayed near the fire, armed. No one questioned the order. The night that followed was the longest any of them would ever experience. It began just after full dark. The herd, which had been silent and still, suddenly shifted, not in panic, but in unison, as though responding to a command that only they could hear. They took 3 steps forward, then stopped, then another 3 steps, then stopped again. The men rose to their feet, watching. Webb called out, asking if anyone had spooked them. No one had. The cattle moved again, 3 steps, then stillness. 3 steps, then stillness. Virgil Tate said later that it looked like the herd was being pulled, not driven, but pulled, as though something ahead of them was drawing them forward against their will. Webb ordered the guards to circle the herd and turn them back. The men rode out, shouting and waving their ropes, trying to redirect cattle. For a moment, it seemed to work. The herd hesitated, and a few of the animals at the edges turned back toward the camp. Then the sound began. It was not loud. That was what every man who heard it agreed upon. It was not loud, and it did not come from any single direction. It was low, deep, and resonant, like the lowest note of a church organ played continuously. It seemed to come from the ground itself, rising up through the earth and into the air. It did not waver or change in pitch. It simply was. The cattle stopped moving. They stood perfectly still, and the sound continued. Tate said that his horse began to tremble beneath him, and that he had to dismount because he feared it would collapse. Another drover said that he felt a vibration in his chest, and that it made his teeth ache. The youngest drover began to cry, though he did not seem aware of it. Webb shouted for the men to fall back to the camp. They obeyed, moving slowly, their eyes fixed on the herd. The cattle did not follow. They remained where they were, standing in the dark, and the sound continued. It lasted for 2 hours. During that time, no one moved. The men stood or sat near the fire, their weapons in their hands, and they waited. Some prayed. Some stared into the darkness. Some closed their eyes and tried to block out the sound, though it was impossible to do so. Webb wrote in his journal that he believed they were going to die. He did not elaborate on why he believed this, only that the certainty of it was absolute, and that he felt no fear, only a strange calm. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that it felt like a physical presence. The cattle remained standing. The men remained still. The fire burned without crackling. The stars above seemed dimmer than they should have been. After several minutes, one of the cattle lay down. Then another. Then, slowly, the rest of the herd followed, until all of them were resting on the ground. The men did not move until dawn. When the sun rose on the morning of April 20th, Clayton Webb gave the order to abandon the herd. It was an extraordinary decision. A trail boss did not leave 1,500 head of cattle unattended on the open prairie. The financial loss would be devastating, and the professional disgrace would follow him for the rest of his career. But Webb gave the order, and his men obeyed without question. They saddled their horses, loaded what supplies they could carry, and rode east at a hard pace. They did not look back. Webb's journal contains no entry for that day. The next entry, dated April 23rd, is written from a camp near the Red River crossing, over 60 miles away. It reads, "Herd abandoned, men safe, will not return." There is no explanation, no description of what led to the decision. The rest of the journal resumes its usual tone, mileage, weather, terrain, as though the previous week had not occurred. The herd was found 2 weeks later by another outfit passing through the area. The cattle were alive and in surprisingly good condition, grazing peacefully in the same stretch of prairie where Webb had left them. There were no signs of predation, no injuries, no indication that anything had disturbed them. The outfit that found them drove the herd to Dodge City and sold them on Webb's behalf, though Webb refused to go near the railhead while they were there. He never led another drive. He returned to Texas and worked on a ranch near Fredericksburg until his death in 1891. His journal was found among his possessions and donated to a local historical society. The torn-out page was never recovered. Of 11 drovers who were with Webb that April, 3 quit the cattle business entirely within 6 months. 2 moved to California and took up farming. 1 became a shopkeeper in St. Louis. The others continued working drives, but none would go through the western portion of Indian Territory again. Virgil Tate's account, given years later to his cousin, is the most detailed. He described the sound, the way the cattle moved, the feeling of being watched by something that could not be seen. He said that he'd been on drives where men were killed, where herds stampeded, where lightning struck so close it burned the hair off a horse's neck. He said that none of those things frightened him the way that night had. When asked what he thought it was, he said he did not know, and that he did not want to know. There are other records, scattered and fragmentary. A letter from Will Mackey to his brother mentions the incident in the territory, and says only that he will not speak of it in detail, but that he has not slept well since. A newspaper article from Dodge City in May of 1878 mentions the recovery of an abandoned herd and notes that the trail boss declined to comment on the circumstances. A map in the possession of a Kansas surveyor, dated 1882, shows a general area where Webb's herd was left. In the margin, in handwriting that does not match the rest of the document, someone has written, "Drovers avoid this ground. Cattle will not pass through after dark." There is no signature. The land where Clayton Webb made camp that April night is still empty. It lies in what is now the western edge of Oklahoma, far from any town, accessible only by unpaved roads that wash out in heavy rain. The wash where the young drover smelled old air as long since filled in, smoothed over by a century of wind and weather. There are no markers, no monuments, nothing to indicate that anything unusual ever occurred there. But the land has a reputation. Ranchers in the area will not graze cattle there, though the grass is decent and the ground is suitable. Hunters avoid it, though they cannot always say why. There are stories, vague and half-remembered, about sounds that carry on certain nights, and about the way animals behave when they get too close. In 1979, a graduate student from the University of Oklahoma attempted to research the incident for a thesis on frontier folklore. She found Webb's journal, read Tate's account, located the scattered letters and references. She drove out to the area one autumn afternoon, intending to take photographs and survey the land. She left before nightfall and did not return. Her thesis, when completed, made no mention of the 1878 incident. When asked about it years later, she said only that some stories were better left alone. There are nights, even now, when the wind moves across that stretch of prairie in a way that does not seem entirely natural, when the grass bends in patterns that suggest something passing through, though nothing can be seen, when the silence is too complete and the air feels heavy, and the stars seem farther away than they should be. The cattle know. They always have. And on certain nights in April, when the conditions are right and the moon is low, ranchers many miles away will find their herds standing in the dark, all facing the same direction, refusing to lie down. They do not ask why. They have learned, as Clayton Webb learned, that some questions do not have answers that a person can live with. The journal sits in a climate-controlled archive now, its pages yellowed and fragile. The torn-out entry has never been found. Perhaps it was destroyed. Perhaps it was lost. Or perhaps Webb kept it with him, folded in a pocket or hidden in a drawer, a reminder of the night when he stood on the edge of something vast and incomprehensible and chose to walk away. He never wrote about it again. He never spoke of it, as far as anyone knows. But in the final weeks of his life, when fever made him restless and the past rose up in fragments, those who sat with him said he would sometimes wake in the dark and whisper the same thing, over and over. The cattle knew. They knew before we did. And then he would fall silent, staring at something no one else could see, until morning came and the fear passed, and he remembered, once again, not to speak of it.